welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo Slayback and Tom Sarrouf. Marlo is back from maternity leave, so we're excited to welcome her back to the podcast. And we had a great episode for her first episode back with Jeff Bilbro, who is an associate professor of English at Grove City College and an editor of the Front Porch Republic. He grew up in the mountainous state of Washington and earned his BA in Writing and Literature from George Fox University in Oregon and his PhD in English from Baylor University. And our episode with Jeff today was talking about Wendell Berry, who's sort of an intellectual forerunner to various elements of the Make America Healthy Again movement. And with that being a very live issue in Congress with the hearings for RFK Jr., we thought we'd have Jeff on to talk more about the intellectual roots of some of these concerns about our health and the way that we live and things like industry and farming, agriculture or localism and the like. So we hope you enjoy the episode.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
So happy to have you, Jeff, talking today about Make America Healthy Again and some of its intellectual forerunners. So the most prominent, I think, advocate and progenitor, I guess, of what we now know as MAHA, which listeners you may have seen on social media and elsewhere, or Make America Healthy Again, was kind of built by RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and it's captured a lot of resentment and frustration that so many Americans have toward the state of health today, and especially with the growing awareness of what's in our food. So one example that listeners you may have heard of, I'm sure, on this call are probably aware of, but seed oils, that's become kind of a dirty word, and people seem to be checking nutrition labels a lot more closely. And there's also the connection between, poor diet and disease. And something that RFK Jr. seemed to have captured especially well was this building frustration among moms. So from, left and right sides of the political aisle. So these moms have especially rallied behind RFK Jr. and the MAHA movement for this reason. But MAHA has an intellectual forerunner, like I mentioned, that I think has been under-discussed and who I think deserves a lot of the credit. And that's why we have you on today, Dr. Bilbro. Before there was MAHA, there was a Kentucky farmer, environmentalist, and writer, Wendell Berry. And for decades, he's been writing about the distance Americans have from their food that they eat. And, he called eating an agricultural act. And something that's really interesting, if you go to Italy, which is kind of this big Italian market grocery store that's located in cities like New York City. I think there's one in San Francisco. The one I saw in New York City actually had this huge poster that had that Wendell Berry quote on it, which was so interesting to see out in the wild, that eating is an agricultural act. So although Berry perhaps wouldn't call himself a conservative, it seems to me that he's one of the most prominent thinkers that is appreciated by conservatives, even if it's like a kind of niche academic group of conservatives that really appreciate Berry. But these are conservatives nonetheless who care about localism, moderation, conservationism, and simple eating and living. So could you introduce us a little bit and introduce our listeners who perhaps aren't as familiar with Wendell Berry's work? Tell us a little bit more about why he's the man for the MAHA moment.
Yeah, I think you set things up really well, Marlo, and maybe like MAHA, Berry has been read by people across the American political spectrum and appreciated across kind of typical party lines. When you encounter somebody who's a Wendell Berry reader, you never know their politics, kind of how they got there. And I think you see, so I guess to your point, right? This sort of scrambling of party lines is present in his work. He likes to say that the liberals write him letters and the conservatives come and visit him. I don't know. I'm not sure why that is. But yeah, he's been writing he's born in 1934 and started writing in the late 50s, early 60s, both fiction and then pretty quickly essays and poetry as well. And I think there's a lot of strands that go into his body of work. He's interested in a lot of different things. If you read his essays, it's kind of you never know what kinds of references he'll make. He'll talk about the Clarence Thomas hearings or the minutia of farming with draft horses, or medieval literature. It's all in there. It's all related to him. But I think to this topic, his most famous book, the book that kind of put him on the map, is Unsettling of America, in which he links the disintegration of rural communities and the sort of unhealthy economics and diet of Americans to Earl Butz and the sort of U.S. Farm policies that he became the spokesman for in his role. So I think Berry is concerned with, this sort of long lineage in America of treating in terms of specialties, things that really need to be understood as wholes. So, for him, it's the kind of myopic fixation on how many bushels of corn can we get out of this piece of land, whatever kind of chemical inputs we need to do, what sorts of technologies we need to rely upon. Those are justified if we can make the numbers go up. And I suppose you see a similar, approach in the modern medical industry or diet, right? Let's just focus on calories or sort of these ingredients, however they're derived, we can just put them in there and then it's going to be healthy. Let's, treat this organ or this particular problem that you have. So it's not even looking at you as an individual, but it's like your body as discrete body parts. And that sort of uber specialized focused approach obviously has power, right? It can bring about some good things, but it really lacks the connections, and it misses the connections between our bodies and how the food is grown, right? Eating is an agricultural act. Between the people that we live with, right? So diet and health, or exercise, or just the whole ways of lifestyle. So, Berry is thinking about agriculture and health, and of course spiritual health also, right? For him, health is spiritual as well as material, in ways that I think defy any sort of disciplinary specialty or political lines. And so, I think there are some connections between the sort of cross-partisan movement behind RFK's Make America Healthy Again and the coalition that Berry has been gathering for decades. Although there's also some tensions, or I don't know if we can talk about this, but Michael Pollan has publicly sort of distanced himself from RFK Jr. Even though Michael Pollan has been on this bandwagon for decades. So, it's a very odd partisan moment, or political moment too, I think.
Hey there, listener. I wanted to take a quick moment to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission here at ISI is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling our mission, consider helping us by rating and reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you listen, to help us reach more listeners like yourself. Now, back to the show. I hope we will have some time to get into some of these tensions, especially when you think about like the rough and tumble politics as coalition building. But I want to sort of hit on one of these themes that, as I was hearing you speak, is I think it's a classic theme in political philosophy, is the disquietude between or about how our relationship is fractured between man and nature. So if we're thinking about human living as holistic, that involves our relationship to the earth, for which we work to sustain and gain our daily bread, so to speak. And I think from Heidegger to Rachel Carson to Greta Thunberg, and probably lumping in a different way Wendell Berry, there's a sort of disquietude or sort of analysis of what that theme looks like, not just theoretically or in terms of our imagination, but also in terms of the practical politics. And I think that, again, is part of what we're all talking about here with the Maha movement as well. So could you speak more to this theme of the relationship between man and nature and how that influences or manifests itself today?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose a couple of things. One is just the fundamental distinction that Berry draws repeatedly between imagining ourselves and the rest of creation in mechanistic terms, right? Man as machine, and then thinking about, well, how do you repair a machine? That's how you also repair a human body. So Berry spends a lot of time trying to tease apart that false analogy and the damages that it causes to how we treat ourselves and others. So yeah, I think there's a lot of, you can think about Heidegger on the questions concerning technology. He's concerned about very similar problems there. But maybe to your broader point, another way of thinking about Berry's kind of unique contribution to this discourse is in terms of his, I'll just say, critique of both obviously the kind of urbanized industrial, detachment from nature on the one hand, but also kind of wilderness preservation on the other hand. So he thinks that the impulse to preserve parts of nature untouched by humans, and then kind of remake entirely or destroy or desecrate other parts of nature are two sides of the same coin, and both come from this perception, this sense that humans really don't belong in nature. We're really separate from nature. And so whenever we're involved, we're going to mess things up. And I guess the best hope is we mess up the least parts and save some untouched, right? And Berry says, no, we have to understand ourselves as part of nature, part of the great chain of being. So he is very much a adherent of this kind of medieval Christian notion of humans as subordinate to God, accountable to God, the creator, but then also over the rest of creation and having a responsibility to steward or take care of the rest of creation. So he is looking for ways that humans can do loving, caring work in creation on the land, in places that participates in the restoration of and healing of a broken creation. So yeah, I think he's this voice for the kind of middle place, right? The garden, the small farm, places where human work can care for and heal what's otherwise unhealthy in some way.
Do you think and I think I've read a piece of yours before that was kind of in response to this criticism that people have about Berry, that his thought and writing is a little bit like idealistic, bucolic, and what he is arguing for. I believe you were actually referring to some of what he's written in his fiction as being kind of a rebuttal to that, as like, no, there is pathology in rural life. So can you talk a little bit about how he frames this kind of lifestyle? And it sounds like he does, talk a little bit about when it all changed, that rural life used to look one way, and after the Great Depression, it's changed so much to what we now know today as being, when we think of Appalachia, for example, and rural poverty. So, and that's been kind of when we're thinking about some of the geographic, the flashpoints in last year in, our political campaigns, things like that, there was some attention paid to this part of the country that is indeed suffering. And obviously Kentucky kind of falls into that geographic region. So could you kind of help us understand some of these criticisms and also how they're framed historically, and how Berry, and maybe this is a more charitable read of Berry, your read of Berry, how you would respond to people who say, like, we don't live, like, no one lives like that anymore, and you can't live like that anymore.
Yeah, wow, that's a lot of important questions there. Yeah, I think maybe to start with, I'll just say Berry's basic way of understanding American life is that the cities, the sort of urban centers, have made a colony of rural places. So he sees it as a kind of colonized relationship in terms of offloading trash and problems to rural places, and then taking out the smart people and bringing them into these cities and leaving their communities the poorer for it. So And if you go to where he lives in rural Kentucky, I mean, it's not an obviously thriving place. It's not the Lexington, nicely manicured, very expensive, probably foreign-owned horse places, right? It's small, steep, rundown places. So he's well aware of the challenges in rural life. And I think, you mentioned the Great Depression. I think that's part of it. He also points to World War II as a kind of inflection point where we develop all these. Well, first of all, we take a lot of people away to fight the wars. And then a lot of the technology and mechanization that gets developed to carry out the war gets brought home and applied to the land. I mean, you could think about this. A lot of the chemicals, right, are actually used for pesticides and fertilizers. So yeah, I think he is not naive or nostalgic about how awesome rural life is. And a lot of his fiction deals with the very messy, broken reality of small communities. And his own family is marked by this. His uncle, whom he's named after, was murdered when he was a boy. His great grandfather was murdered, and both of these are fictionalized in his novels. There's also a lot of there's not too much drug abuse, but there's a lot of drunkenness, alcohol. So there's marriage abuse. So he's well aware that like these communities are damaged in part because of the external kind of political and economic and cultural forces. So there's plenty of systemic blame, but also just because they're inhabited by humans. And as he says in one of his essays I was teaching this week, humans don't just have problems, they are problems, So he's got a pretty realistic view of human nature and is recognizes that any community made of humans is going to be broken. But nonetheless, he thinks the remedy for these issues is not kind of further outside expertise, telling people how to live their lives or giving life hacks, or of course not like drugging people to make them live well. The solutions are always going to be humble, and they're going to entail people trying to cultivate cultures of virtue and good work to do the necessary tasks that need to be done in the places where they live.
And building off of that point, Jeff, what role is there in terms of, you can think about like theory, and then you can think about like political practice. What is the role for, policy or activism for Berry? Because my understanding is that he has some, if you think about like activists, they're going out and maybe being disruptive or sort of civil disobedience. You can think about that in terms of, in all sorts of different, ways. But is this more of does he have, specific policy prescriptions, or is this more of a theoretical sort of ideal that we might be able to live in our local places, but there's not, I guess maybe another way of asking it is there an irony that, maybe a more localist, frugal, simple living focused on remedying these various fractures within modern living, is there a sort of irony that this is now being taken up, in some respects at least, by the national government? Or would that be something that, Berry says, actually, it's fine that the national government is going to, to take Marlo's example, ban seed oils or investigate what plastics are doing in our food and in our bloodstream and things of that sort?
Yeah, I think he would say kind of a both and approach. On the one hand, he's been very skeptical and critical of a kind of activist mentality. I mean, he protested, back in the 70s, he protested against nuclear power plants. He's been pretty active against mountaintop coal mining in Kentucky. But he's always sort of uneasy with the limits of protest. He has this great little essay written in the 70s called Think Little. And it begins with racism and the Vietnam War protests. And he says, we're not really fixing the problem by protesting, in part because we think that the problem is out there and we are pure. And he says maybe the environmental movement can be different because it's so obvious that our lifestyles and our actions are part of the issues. And we can't pretend that if we could just fix those people over there, life would be better. And so in that essay, he says, the best thing you can do if you want to help the earth is grow a garden. And not only, and that can be read as like just withdraw from politics, but he's clearer than that. I think he says, the reason why growing a garden would help is it would, yeah, begin to solve the problem where you are, but it would also make the necessary changes in your mind. You would become a more critical, thoughtful, implicated thinker. And so then the policies of the broader solutions that you're pursuing would flow out of that kind of formative practice. So yeah, he has written, he's worked with Wes Jackson on this thing they call the 50-year Farm Bill, kind of trying to reimagine the U.S. Farm Bill. And others have tried to take it. I mean, Joel Salatin has been maybe tapped to have some role in the USDA. I think Salatin would have a lot of overlap with some of Berry's concerns with making it easier for, say, small butchers or small farmers to have a market for their crops. But I do think there's always going to be this tension between, what can be done in policy to sort of make space for local agriculture and local food. And certainly the whole U.S. farm bureaucracy and health, I think, has incentivized and led to a very unhealthy system, right? So unwinding some of that is itself helpful. But even if you can set like a better system in place, it's still going to take a lot of local work. So I think it's a both and kind of thing, like putting a better framework in place, but then recognizing you cannot legislate your way to health.
That makes sense. And to follow up, when you think about like the issue of climate change, the way it's talked about, the way like what most of the solutions are, and I'll give one example. I was at this conference in Taipei in Taiwan a couple of years ago, and the theme was something about like towards carbon net zero 2030 climate action goals, some long title. And one of the keynote speakers said something to the effect of, if we could just get to carbon net zero, then all of the Earth's temperature would never change again. He literally said that verbatim, and I was shocked because that assumes that the only problem with the only input that goes into climate is what the carbon count is. And I think if he was pushed on that, he would say, well, no, actually, but still, I mean, to make a claim like that and be platformed, and the whole thing was just like, all right, we're going to do like green this and green that, and it's kind of just a meme. And then it's also explained as, well, this is a global problem. Even people like the Dalai Lama point this out. Like, climate change is a global problem. It requires global solutions. Like you at Grove City and, Marlo and I here, we can't solve climate change. You need like national governments and international corporations and international governing bodies need to solve this. And it's almost the inverse, I think, of what Berry's saying, which is like there's a role for all of that, but this is also an individual problem in a way in which we participate. But at the same time, I feel like a lot of people on our side see people who say like, oh, if we just like carbon net zero everything, we'd be totally good. And go, oh, well, that's clearly stupid. Like, that's just not true. And that's really silly. And sort of just like throw their hands up and go, all right, well, we don't need to worry about this because the people who are arguing it don't make any sense. So could you speak more to like what Berry would say about like a specific issue like climate change, which I would say has been a losing issue for our side because we haven't talked much about it.
Yeah, it's a great way of framing the problem, Tom. Because I think it's really tragic how climate change has been politicized. In terms, as you put it, right, it's the same kind of specialized approach. Well, what's the problem? Carbon dioxide. So any solution that like moves the needle on carbon dioxide must be good. And let's just fixate on that, right? Rather than, I mean, and I think the environmental movement in the U.S. anyway used to have a much more a much broader focused more on pollution, on air quality, water quality, right? Things that people could see tangibly nearby that were affecting their lives, and also things that were easier to clean up, right? Like we can stop dumping toxins in the Cuyahoga River and maybe it will stop being on fire. It'd be good. I live north of Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh was a mess in terms of air pollution, and it's a lot better now because people change things. So it's really too bad that the left sort of latched onto carbon dioxide as this way of justifying state control, and the conservative movement, instead of saying, well, actually we could care about our place and a healthy creation in other ways, just sort of said, well, if that's our option, then we're no. and have failed to put forward more creative and responsible, I think, policies. So again, you see, as Marlo began with, right, there is kind of a cross-partisan concern for health, and the early environmental movement in the U.S. with Rachel Carson, or I'm here in Grove City, Francis Schaeffer, conservative Christian, used to be a pastor here. In the 1970s, around Earth Day, he has this book, Pollution and the Death of Man, a conservative Christian approach to caring for our common home. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of work for conservatives to reclaim caring for our bodies, caring for our earth, caring for creation in ways that don't necessarily just sort of empower, I don't know, distant government bureaucrats to do carbon swaps or, all these kind of things that aren't actually going to improve the situation, but just kind of bureaucratize it.
That's actually a great segue into, I wanted to tell everyone about the book
Yes.
Cons by Rod Dreher, because
Yeah.
you make a great point about that, like, the book talks a lot about, I mean, just to read the on the front page for people who are unfamiliar, the book's from 2006. So this was, Crunchy Cons is something that like some like ISI, aligned folks, maybe Grove City folks, people who are aware of like, Wendell Berry, the Southern Agrarians, those types of thinkers are probably familiar with, but I've met a lot of people who haven't heard of it, and I think it's like people need to be paying more attention to this book, because let me just read it to just what the front page says. How Birkenstock Burkians, gun-loving organic gardeners, evangelical free-range farmers, hip homeschooling mamas, right-wing nature lovers, and their diverse tribe of countercultural conservatives plan to save America, or at least the Republican Party. So I feel like that's a lot of what we're talking about, and I think there is more of a acceptance of the non-ideological, weirdly enough, right now,
Yeah.
Especially on the right, where you do have, some of these more popular figures, and people like RFK Jr., who was running a campaign on, largely on out of the interest of people's health and health concerns about like red dye 40 or whatever in people's food. And so I've been rereading this book because I'm I'm a home birth mom, at least my first child. We don't have seed oils in our house. We use a Berkey filter. So anyone who kind of has the similar lifestyle that Rod Dreher lays out in this book is probably familiar with all those things, but they seem very kind of like strange and kind of weird to people who are a little bit more mainstream. But I think they are increasing in just visibility of these lifestyles that a lot of conservatives are starting to adopt, because they do see kind of this pathology that stems from the distance that we have from nature, but also from, even food, like seeing some of the just really inhumane treatments of animals on farms is a really unsettling thing. And Wendell Berry, it's even in his essays, which I recommend everyone read, because they aren't they are philosophically deep, but they're also extremely palatable and they're digestible. But he talks a lot about that. And I feel like this in tandem to this book, in tandem with Berry's thinking, and Dreher does reference Berry quite a bit, and also Russell Kirk as well. So he's another thinker that I feel like maybe doesn't talk, explicitly a lot about health, but he talks a lot about local institutions and the importance of localism. So could you kind of tie these concepts together for us, like for maybe people who aren't as familiar with the crunchy conservative? It seems like something that's a little bit more like, I don't want to say new age, but something that Rod Dreher was writing in the early 2000s. But it seems like it's actually, if anything, these are the original conservatives. This is the outlook that a lot of conservatives tried to have for their lives and their lifestyles and their temperament. And it was a very non-ideological thing that maybe, over time, especially in the 2000s, became kind of, focused more on consumption and, more popular, pop culture attitudes, things like that.
Yeah, I think you're right, Marlo. I mean, that's a great book. I think it's Dreher's first book, and it's very good. And he explicitly tries to show, it is a conservative vision, but there's all kinds of it's non-ideological, and there's all kinds of sort of hospitality toward people who might differ in some ways, but can share this kind of vision of the good life. Yeah, so there's a lot that could be said. Maybe I'll just make one point. I think one way to understand this kind of paradigm shift, and you alluded to it maybe at the end of your comments there, is whether you conceive of yourself primarily as a consumer or a producer. And, if you're just a passive consumer and you have to take whatever is being fed to you and you just want, the cheapest, most enjoyable experiences that you can buy, then you're not interested in this, right? But that's a very impoverished vision of the human life, right? Human as consumer. And Berry is in this whole stream of thinkers. Like you can think about the distributists, right? You can think about people like Kirk or Burke, who think the good life consists of healthy relationships with your family and your place and your community, and work that is producing things that you and your neighbors need, right? Work that serves the common good in a local, tangible way. And I think in an increasingly kind of digital, abstract economy, people are really hungry to recover some sense of agency, some sense of working with their hands and doing good work. So maybe there's this moment where the CrunchyCon kind of failed and to catch on in the mid 2000s, but maybe it could gain traction now. I don't know. I think that it's definitely a time of very fluid kind of political identity, and so I have hope that people like Berry, people like the Dreyer of CrunchyCons can kind of offer a different vision of what we could work on together in our local and then scaled up to national politics.
I'd be curious, Jeff, to hear what you think about the prospects of what we might call like a Berryite part of the coalition, because we are talking about this sort of in the context of, RFK is likely to become the Secretary of Health and Human Services. You sort of mentioned some tensions. There are always going to be tensions in any sort of practical political coalition. But, if we think Berry is someone who's he's in the world of politics, or maybe he's of it but not in it, or he plays some role or has some ideas about what one could do, and kind of looking for the right people with whom to make the kind of consensus or the coalition that that improves things, not just sort of in a very consequential way. But what do you think of the prospects of adding the Berryites to the coalition, or is it the fact that some of the principles are so diametrically opposed that it'll collapse as soon as it gets underway?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I don't follow these things super closely, but my tendency is to be pretty pessimistic, in part because I think there's just these irresolvable tensions in the coalition, and I don't know. I'm not optimistic that the kind of Berryite people have, like Joel Salatin, right? I don't think he's gonna win the day. There's these tensions between the kind of the tech bros and the RFK people, right? So it's Elon Musk and just kind of build things, which in parts of that I think actually can be healthy, but Elon's vision of sort of AI and space is very non-Berryan, right? So there's that tension, right? And a lot of people have been writing about this and thinking about that. And then I think there's also this tension between, are you trying to just break things apart, or are you trying to build better? And I guess maybe you raised this earlier, Tom, with your question about whether the role of the government is to just get out of the way, or whether there is some role for the government. And the kind of industrial, big ag, CAFO, right, concentrated animal feedlot operations, all of these institutions have so much momentum and money behind them. And I'm not super convinced that you can just put a different person in at the USDA, or put a different person in, I guess, RFK's Secretary of Health and Human Services, who can somehow change the whole apparatus and actually reorient it to a more localized food economy. So my fear is, I guess, even if you change the top person and he or she has good visions, they're just, it's just going to be this irresolvable tension. And I think too, I think Brooke Rollins is supposed to be the new USDA person if she gets nominated, and she's pretty status quo, big ag. So again, that to me is a sign that there's so much money behind industrial agriculture as usual that it's unlikely to really get unwound. So that's my pessimistic view, but I would love to be surprised.
Are there any other thinkers that you would suggest we look at? If for anyone who's interested in anything that we've talked about in this podcast, whether it's Wendell Berry or Roger's book, or overall, I guess the umbrella of crunchy cons, because like Russell Kirk, I would say the progenitor of kind of the like 30,000-foot view of what he, as the father of American conservatism. And then you have kind of these specialized, lifestyles and experiences that kind of fall underneath what his thought was. But is there anyone else that we're missing in this episode that you think is also kind of tied into or has contributed to this this body of thought, or like major people, like I would say even like Pat Buchanan to some degree is kind of adjacent to it, but is there anyone else?
I mean, the other person I keep thinking about in recent weeks, and this, his name has been floating around ever since 2016, but is Christopher Lasch and his work on the revolt of the elites. And I just keep thinking, like, what he warned in the 90s is so prescient that if the elites continue to betray their public responsibilities and continue to kind of treat the plebes as these unenlightened masses that we can control and fix, they'll lose authority, they'll lose trust. And I think that's really come to fruition now, that the elite, whether it's in terms of universities or legacy media or politicians, have lost, I think deservedly lost trust. And so you see, but the result is this kind of unstable flux, right, between people who are trying to reclaim trust or just assert, you should trust me, I know the facts, and then most of us who've kind of lost faith but don't know who to turn to. There's a really great essay just came out last week in New Atlantis by a friend of mine, Garth Brown, who's a farmer up in New York State, about the ways that the failure of public health has made space for these lifestyle gurus who are on YouTube or whatever. And sometimes, they say great things like you should work out or you should eat healthier. But also they're always like shilling some random supplement, or they have some crazy, scientific theory about how if you just eat this thing, liver, then you'll be healthy, right? So it's totally the Wild West. And his point is like, I would prefer not to live in either a failed industrial medicine system or I don't know who to trust, and I have these 10 gurus who all tell me the secret to a healthy life. But I think that's kind of where we are right now. And, my hope is that we could regain some more responsible institutions and responsible expertise, people who are have a better sense of the public they're supposed to serve. And I think Christopher Lasch would be a pretty good guide in that. So he doesn't talk explicitly about health, but I think the dynamic that he is warning about absolutely explains why you have somebody like RFK, who, right, it's hard to imagine him being nominated by a Republican politician for this role. Why you have somebody like RFK who's become the kind of spokesperson for Make America Healthy Again.
And I think that's also interesting because Lasch, I think, right, tell me if I'm wrong, Jeff, he is someone more of the political left.
Yeah. Very dissatisfied with the left as it had come to be, yeah.
Or someone like Michael Lind, who I enjoy reading on the economy, is like another one of those people. Yeah. It's like trying to save them from themselves. But at the risk of doing violence to Barry's own thought, where part of, I think, the critique, or as I've understood it in our conversation, is like subordinating everything to utility or efficiency or practice. There is some sort of practical program at play that we've already talked about. So I guess there's a two-part question here. Is if if Health and Human Services, if the Department of Agriculture, Department of Energy were to try and fix or address some of the threats and challenges that we've raised, or that where Berry raises and throughout the corpus of his writing, to also help restore or give pride of place to some of Berry's goals or his vision, what would those some of those practical things be? And the second part is, so if there's a sort of both and piece that you mentioned, that's the one piece, and then the what can we do in our own personal lives, who are interested in Berry, who what should we do? So
Yeah.
what can we do at a national level, or in sort of thinking in terms of systems, and then also in terms of our day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I mean, admittedly, I'm not a policy guy, so you should talk to somebody else. But the kinds of things that excite me, that I think, oh, this would really change, and Barry talks about these kind of things, are just changing the regulatory landscape so that the big producers face more obstacles, and the little producers have an easier path. So, for instance, in Pennsylvania, where I'm from, kind of famously last year, or maybe 2 years ago, there's this Amish guy who sells raw milk, right? And he's just been persecuted by regulators for selling raw milk to customers because it's unsafe. So there's a lot. There has been some improvement on that front, but it's still really hard to sell food, whether it's milk or meat, stuff that maybe you bake in your home kitchen. Some states are better than others in terms of allowing home production to be sold. But a lot of butchers have a hard time making it because you have to pay for a USDA certified inspector, which is only workable if you have a huge scale that can pay for that. So there's all these ways in which the system makes it hard for local small scale producers, and kind of helps the bigger ones maintain an advantage that's not natural. It's not like they're more efficient somehow. It's just that the regulatory landscape favors them. So I think in all kinds of ways, both the agriculture and the food industry, I would love to see a shift there. And then, Marlo had kind of offhandedly mentions just a few of the things that you can do as an individual or as a community in terms of trying to take more ownership for your food production. And I think during COVID, people got into baking bread. That's still good. You can grow a lot of food even in a suburban plot. So I think if we can take some ownership of where our food is coming from, and talk with our neighbors about that, maybe you're not going to be growing the majority of your food, but maybe a lot of your food you either grow or who you're buying it from, right? It's pretty easy where we live to buy a share of a cow from a local farmer that's good local meat. So I think just caring about that and recognizing these are choices we're making that are about how we eat, but also about how we relate to our local community and economy. And right now, I can get eggs a whole lot cheaper from my neighbor than I can from the grocery store. So it's just an example, right, of how a big centralized system is also quite vulnerable to disruptions, like we're seeing with the chicken market right now.
Well, I think we only have time for one more question, unfortunately, even though I have so many. I've been thinking about this a lot because I'm trying to write a piece about it. But something that occurred to me while I was thinking through, how I think Berryite thought in a way could have, for the people who are inclined towards, the sourdough baking, the, signing up for a local food co-op, the raw milk drinkers who perhaps are more at the level of like, okay, we're making these lifestyle changes out of consideration for our health, can take it to the next level. And something that occurred to me when I was thinking about that is, in a climate of, I don't want to say economic precariousness in a way that is like there's, a total crisis right now, but it does occur to me that, a lot of, especially Gen Z, millennials, we've probably all seen the different studies that show like home ownership and just ownership property is something that a lot of them don't see for themselves in the foreseeable future, that, they're lifetime renters in many cases. And when I was thinking about that, it does strike me as, would that be an impediment to a lot of the sort of localism and the sort of, ownership of your domain that allows for this love of place, that I feel like someone who appreciates Barry would be drawn to and find, accessible in their daily habits and routines. So is that something that you think would be, I'm sure maybe it's an obstacle that, just advice for any students who are listening to this who are like, well, I'd like to live like that, but I'm renting until, the foreseeable future and I'm in a city that perhaps doesn't allow for that. And I don't know where I'm going to live next because, I'm just always on the move. And there's atomization that has unfortunately kind of been inflicting, a lot of these different communities where there isn't as much of a cohesive like fabric like there once was. So how do you address that perhaps with your own students who you see some of these different issues with, maybe not so much at Grove City as you would maybe at, like, I went to the University of Pittsburgh actually,
Yeah.
where there isn't as tight knit of a faith community, but for students who perhaps, they don't go to schools like that, or maybe they don't have a community like that, what's your advice?
Yeah, that's a really perceptive question, Marlo, because I do think that the kind of renting economy and the mobile economy makes it really hard. I mean, no one's going to put a garden in a rental, or very few, right? Because you're going to do all this work and then 2 years are gone. Plus, there's usually not space anyway. So yeah, I think that's actually a huge obstacle that recent college grads, many of them face. And it's been a problem for a while in terms of farmland. Farmland is so expensive now. It's so capital intensive. It's really hard to break in. It's hard even to pass it on to a child. So yeah, I've talked to a lot of people who want to farm or want to get more involved, but just cannot afford or find land. So I do think, there are options, like some places continue to have sort of garden shares where you can rent or just sign up for a chunk of land in your neighborhood, in your town. This is obviously very spotty. It's not like a norm like it is in some parts of the world, but it's I think it's becoming more common in places where people don't own land, right? Whether apartments or whatever in cities. So I'm encouraged by that. I think that's and plus then you get to work alongside your neighbors, and if you're on vacation, somebody else can water your garden for you. So I see that. I also see, increasing interest, and maybe this is just at Grove City or kind of places like this, but increasing interest in some sort of communal living, right? Like, let's work together, and 3 or 4 of us are going to graduate together, and maybe some people are getting married, and 2 couples are going to buy a house together or try to get a house together. So I wonder if that kind of shared living, co-living, could feed into this, right? Then they're not likely you're sharing meals together. Maybe you can afford a house with some land. So I think that's one response to the problem of expensive housing that I think is also a response to the problem of loneliness and atomization, and trying to bring your community with you and seed that, and then hope that you can invite others into that and be a kind of hospitable locus of community.
That's really interesting. I've never heard anyone propose that before.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jeff, this has been great, and thank you very much for joining us to talk more about Wendell Berry and a lot of these live issues right now. If people want to follow more of your work, where do you recommend they go?
I have a website, jeffbilbro.com, where I post essays, and my books are there. And I also edit a website, Front Porch Republic, that is kind of a Wendell Berry fan club, you might say. So we post an essay pretty much every day of the week on all kinds of topics. We just had 2 weeks ago, an essay by one of RFK Jr.'s speechwriters about stuff. So yeah, that's a good place to go to.
Very cool. Thanks again, Jeff.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to check out our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, debates, lectures, and of course, this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.